Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets, joined by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves. We're recording this Monday night, April 10th. It's a little over 24 hours since the season officially ended in Washington. Rockets won their third straight game and 4th out of 5 to close out the year, tied for the second worst record in the NBA / number 2 spot in the NBA draft lottery, or the odds, I should say, because it's not so much the lottery, it's the floor scenario of what you can potentially get. If you don't win the lottery, there will be a coin flip to determine whether they're second or third at some point next week. Also a coin flip involving the Clippers and that pick that's going to Houston. But really, that's a footnote at this point. The bigger news coming out of that game, despite the strong finish to the season, as we predicted on previous episodes of this show, it was not enough to save the job of Stephen Silas, who did not have his option picked up for a 4th season. So the Rockets are in the head coaching market. And that's what we're going to be talking about on today's show, because Rafael Stone, GM of the Rockets, just wrapped up a press conference at Toyota Center in which he talked about the decision to move on from Stephen Silas, what they're looking for in the upcoming coaching search, and a bit about the offseason as a whole. We know it's pivotal for the Rockets with not just the coaching search, but another high draft pick in all likelihood, 2 in the first round as it stands today, and the most cap room, give or take $60 million, of any team in the NBA heading into free agency. Could there be a reunion with James Harden? So many possibilities. It's going to be a busy offseason, and perhaps it's fitting that the Rockets did not wait at all. Literally, the reports started trickling out as soon as the buzzer hit in Washington that Silas was done, made it official today, and now the coaching search is officially underway. Paulo, I know you have not been the biggest fan of Stephen Silas over his 3 years in Houston. We don't want to be overly critical of a guy who now is part of Rockets history, but I suspect you're pretty pleased that the Rockets have turned the page on the Stephen Silas era, correct?
Yeah, it was largely expected, right? Just from earlier in the season, just all the signs pointed to him being gone. It was just way too good of an opportunity to not take to get a high-profile head coach if they do end up getting one. Hopefully they do. But as far as Stephen Silas goes, you've got to respect him. He was really poised, even in the post-game presser. It was not an easy spot to be in, to have the news come out that you're fired, in between the end of the game and you actually get into the press room. He was very poised in the way that he complimented the organization. He said he was not wrong. Nobody did anything wrong by him. I think that's, a good way to approach it. I was expecting it to be a lot messier, although it's only been 24 hours, so who knows what Stephen A. Smith may have cooked up. But yeah, as far as Silas goes, it's just, it wasn't the right coach. It wasn't the right situation for him. We talked about in the last pod that a lot of coaching ends up being situational, that guys, every coach that's available got fired from their previous job, basically. So basically no coach leaves a team on not good terms, but coming out of doing a stellar job. So you're never going to get a guy that, unless a franchise just gets deleted from the league, there's just no way of that happening. He wasn't the right fit here. I have my own personal opinions about how good or bad of a coach he is, but sometimes I'm sure he's good at stuff that got hindered because of the roster construction that we had, because we didn't have a good point guard. And there's stuff that he's bad at that got exacerbated because of the roster that we had as well. Maybe I put this out there the day before he got fired. Who knows if Jason Kidd gets fired and he gets brought to Dallas, and all of a sudden they look like a good team because he gets the engine that he so much needs to run the offense that he wants to run. Who knows? Yeah. The point being that I think, and just as a fan, for a little context, I became a fan of the Rockets, or I became a fan of the NBA because of how different it is, because of trades, cap space, the I mean, there being a salary cap, the draft, all of these, things that are so different from how sports are done in Europe where I live. Um, so that's what kind of, made me fall in love with the NBA. And then I chose a team based off the team that, takes that back then was known for having the most moves and having, the Daryl Morey was always known as the guy that's really smart and working around the margins of the cap and taking advantage of everything. And so that's how I got into this. And now the Rockets are in a position where a lot is going to change in one off season. And so this is kind of like my kind of like wet dream of NBA fandom. This is like, okay, a lot of stuff is about to happen. Let's see how we navigate this. And Stephen Silas is kind of the first domino to fall. And
Right.
if they're able to replace Stephen Silas with, I mean, the top names that you hear out there, Nick Nurse, Ime Udoka, Kenny Atkinson, I think that by itself, with the team that we had before, is like a 10-win improvement. And this is not counting potential James Harden comeback and another top pick. And we'll get into what Stone said in the press conference, but more veterans, stuff like that. That's just so much that's going to be going on that it feels incredibly hopeful and optimistic to
Agreed.
have that first step out of the way, because as obvious as it was, it is still the NBA, and we were expecting Eric Gordon to be traded for 2.5 years now, and he only got traded this year. So you never know. And to actually have that domino fall and be able to be excited again for all of the new possibilities that a different coach can bring with the tools that we already have on the roster. Jalen Green's usage off ball, just being able to actually exploit mismatches with basically everyone on the roster that we just don't, and we were terrible at identifying them. All of this stuff, there was a big black cloud of stuff that we attributed to Stephen Silas that is not there anymore, and perhaps it's overly optimistic. I mean, it probably is over optimistic, but now you're starting to wonder for all of these things that you were already resignated to not happening before, that they may be exploited now, as far as the on-court product goes. And so, much respect for Stephen Silas for being gracious in the way that he left. Wasn't an easy situation, but at the same time, I mean, you can't convince me that if he could go back in time, that he would decline the job. So you can't really say that his situation was all that unfair.
Right. I agree. And as a side note, you mentioned the Eric Gordon trade. Sometimes that stuff can be worth the wait because ultimately we now know that pick from the Clippers is going to be between 18 and 20, moving up from 30 because the Bucks had the best record in the league and would have been, well, they are last. So ultimately, waiting on Eric Gordon, I know that's not what we're talking about, but that ended up being a pretty good move, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, since we're not going to be doing draft talk, I'll take this small window to manifest Derek Lively to the Houston Rockets
There you
with
go.
whatever pick that ends up being, because I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna get into it. We'll get into it on another podcast, but
Yeah.
the guy's good.
Yeah, we may follow up on it in a week or so when the NBA actually does the coin flips. And so we have more resolution on where that pick is and also the scenarios of what happens with the Rockets pick relative to the Spurs and the pick floor. Are they guaranteed at 5 or 6, or could they fall to 7? Again, we won't know that until next week because the NBA is going to wait on those flips until the results of the play-in tournament are in, because there's also going to be ties involving teams in the play-in tournament. Actually, one of the two teams that's tied with the Clippers is the Miami Heat. Everyone expects them to advance from the Eastern Conference play-in field, and hopefully they do. They're the number 7 seed. They're going to be favorites in any game they play. Of course, they're in the Eastern Conference Finals a year ago. They're veteran laden. Both of the games would be at home. They only need to win one. Hopefully, they win the first one. If somehow they don't, there actually wouldn't be a tie with the Clippers. The Clippers would then just have a two-way coin flip with the Warriors, in which they'd be sorting out 19 and 20. So actually one of the two Rocket scenarios does depend on something to happen with the play-in tournament. So that's why it's not going to be until next week. Maybe we'll talk more draft after that when we have a bit more precision with where the potential outcomes are for the Rockets going into the draft lottery. Anyway, today's about coaching. And I thought your points on Stephen were fair. They're largely in alignment with mine. By the way, for anyone wanting more immediate insight throughout the offseason, you can follow Paolo on Twitter at Paolo Alves NBA, me on there at Ben Dubose, and this show at The Logger Line. As far as Steven in particular, look, he's an offense first coach. We know what he did as effectively the offensive coordinator those 2 years in Dallas with Luka, where they were the most efficient offense in NBA history. And this Rockets team the last 3 years has been just the complete opposite of that. And in reality, it put him in a no-win situation because their biggest weakness, we talked about it a lot, is not really having a true point guard, a guy that could really run the offense, nothing close to a heliocentric option. And so it was definitely a rough spot for him in terms of roster composition. The records, they were 59 and 177, won just 25% of their games over those 3 years, one of the league's bottom three teams. Well, tied for second worst this year and the worst his first 2 years. Not really his fault. Again, transition to a very young rebuilding roster after James Harden forced his way out really within weeks of Stephen taking the job. So at a macro level, this really isn't his fault. And it's entirely possible that he ends up being the next JB Bickerstaff. A lot of people thought when Bickerstaff was never the true full-time guy. He was an interim for most of the 2015 to 2016 season, but people were not impressed, at least Rockets fans that I follow on social media and blogs, with the job he did here. And yet a couple of years later, he found himself in a better situation in Cleveland and now looks like a very solid coach. Perhaps the same thing happens with Stephen in a better situation. And personally, I hope it does. He's a great guy. He's been nothing but respectful to me personally and those of us in the media. He's been a joy to deal with. He works hard. I just think more than anything, it was always a bad mix because when the Rockets moved on from James Harden and you had an extraordinarily young roster with no clear leadership, and then you had both a first-time GM and a first-time head coach, it's rough. There's no voice of authority that can calm everything down and command instant respect and credibility. And some of this may be theoretical, but again, we're going into a summer with all this cap room. Perception matters, and how the Rockets are perceived by guys around the league, veterans, that they want to take their $60 million in cap room, it absolutely matters. And I think that's something that even if we heard Rafael Stone in his press conference today push back strongly on the notion of culture issues. He spoke about the Rockets working extremely hard and believing they have one of the best cultures in the league when it comes to the day in, day out environment in the building. Even if some of these issues are more perception than reality, you're entering a phase now of your rebuild as you wind down the so-called tanking era and go into starting next season really trying to win, because as Rafael mentioned in his press conference today, they don't control the draft pick a year from now. Oklahoma City, it is top four protected, but other than that, OKC basically gets their pick as a result of the Russell Westbrook Chris Paul trade from 2019. It was a very tough time to have first timers as your GM and head coach. And perhaps the last couple of years, it didn't really matter that much. It's not like you had any cap room to go out and pursue guys on the market. But now it sort of does matter as you're transitioning stages. And so even if some of it is perception based, the reality is that the Rockets need someone, a voice that's been there, done that. And I just think the reality, if you're going to change one of the two positions, as we've spoken about in the past, it's just much easier to change out the head coach. They typically have a shorter shelf life for a reason. The guys the Rockets are looking into, big names like Nick Nurse, Frank Vogel, they've literally won the NBA championship within the last 4 years, and they're still on the market, or in the case of Nurse, expected to be on the market. That's how short the lifespan is with a typical NBA head coach in that position. Whereas a GM, they typically stay around for a lot longer. It takes a more extended period of time to understand if their plan is working or not. And as we've discussed in the past, over the past 3 years, there's just objectively more success stories that you can point to with Rafael Stone than Stephen Silas. So if you're going to make a change, it made more sense to do it on the head coaching front. You add in his contract is up anyway, and it's financially a good time to do it. It just made sense for Stephen to be the guy to go rather than Rafael. Should point out that Rafael, to my understanding, is still on his contract that he got in 2020, the same offseason they brought in Stephen, at the same time that they made Stephen, or shortly before they made Stephen the GM, or made Stephen the head coach, they made Rafael the GM, and they gave him, of course, a new contract at that time when he was moving from the number 2 over Daryl Morey to now the number 1 leading all of basketball operations. And so with that new contract, which typically goes 4 to 5 years is standard length for a GM. I don't have it completely confirmed, but they haven't given him an extension yet to my knowledge. So if things don't turn around in the next year, I do think it's possible you could revisit the Rafael situation. But to this point, I don't think you needed to change both. Changing one would be enough, at least for the time being, going into this summer where you need to make a name for yourself on the market. And I just think for a lot of reasons, it made more sense for head coach to be the position that ultimately you change out. Now, as far as the search and what comes next, what I really want to underscore going into this process is how important it is to keep an open mind. And I think the Rockets are doing that because so much of the success or failure of a coaching hire, it's situational. It comes down to the mix at a given time. It's very unlikely you're going to hire a Greg Popovich or Phil Jackson, someone that's going to be your coach for a generation. You're more trying to find the guy for a few years who just clicks on and off the court with your players, with your organization, that can just be the right guy for now. That's simply the way the market works. And again, that's why guys like Nurse and Vogel are on the market in the first place, despite recently winning the whole enchilada. That's just the reality of the NBA marketplace. And in this case, look, we can talk about the 2020 fit and why, ultimately it was not a successful hire. They didn't get what they wanted to from Stephen Silas, even though they praised him today. There's a reason why they're moving on. And some of it, well, a lot of it, in my opinion, was circumstantial. The factors off the court when it comes to everything with the lack of stability in the organization, so many first timers, and needing that voice to command authority. The reverse of that was 2016 with Mike D'Antoni, which I would say that's the second greatest hire from a head coaching perspective in Rockets franchise history. Only Rudy Tomjanovich, and that was 30 years ago, and he's the only guy that's brought Houston NBA championships. Only that is better. To me, Mike D'Antoni, even though he was here for 4 years, again, short shelf life, Mike D'Antoni was a home run hire. Paolo, would you agree on that?
Are we saying at the time he was hired or
Well,
based on
no,
the
I'm saying in
results?
hindsight. In
Yeah,
hindsight,
in
based on
hindsight,
the results.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
because the reason I'm bringing up the D'Antoni angle, it was not well liked at the time. In 2016, I mentioned the Bickerstaff year. The Rockets were coming off a year in which they were terrible defensively, and all the talk was about bringing in a Jeff Van Gundy type to restore defense, hold James Harden more accountable, make them more disciplined up and down the roster. And they ended up going the complete opposite direction with Mike D'Antoni, a guy who's known for his offense. And yet, what's interesting is that when the Rockets 2 years later in 2018 got to a championship level, I know they didn't win the championship. Pick whatever you want to blame, be it Chris Paul's hamstring, Scott Foster, historic outlier of an 0-for-27 shooting stretch. We can agree the 65-17 Rockets were absolutely a championship level team. They were not running the traditional Mike D'Antoni offense, the 7 seconds or less with Steve Nash and the Suns. It was a very modified version in which they played to the isolation skills of James Harden and Chris Paul. And a lot of it was by design because they knew that basically you couldn't beat those Warriors playing pretty. They just had too much skill. If you got out, made it a fast-paced game, too many shooters, too many playmakers. So they tried to make it ugly, slow the game down. It also played into their defensive schemes and the switch everything that they were able to do, especially when they brought in PJ Tucker. And to Mike D'Antoni's credit, he also installed Jeff Bezdelek as basically his defensive coordinator. That's another thing to consider going into this coaching search. It's not about just who the head coach is. It's also about the composition of the entire staff, their vision for how it all fits together. But I just think that philosophically, number one, D'Antoni went against what the common narrative was at the time as far as what they needed. And then even compared to D'Antoni's own history, the way it played out was very modified in terms of the way the D'Antoni Rockets actually played relative to his track record. Basically, he adapted his system to what was best for the roster and the league at that time, with the Warriors as the primary competition. So the reason I bring all that up, I think a lot of people are getting too in the weeds in terms of evaluating Nurse, Vogel, Atkinson, Udoka, Scott Brooks, all these candidates. And, these are all names I'm talking about because they've been mentioned in various reports as options, and each of them does have some credibility. I believe all 5 of those has at least taken a team to the NBA Finals, or in the case of Atkinson, he's been there as the lead assistant for Golden State, and he has head coaching experience otherwise. I think can sometimes be too much analysis of, okay, what is this coach's particular skill set in terms of X's and O's, and how does it blend with the exact roster the Rockets have now, and maybe some of the free agency targets like James Harden. Reality is, number one, your roster could change, but secondly, the coach, as D'Antoni did, may end up changing his scheme a little bit to fit the roster. There's only so many ways you can play basketball. It's 2023. The NBA has been around for over 75 years. There's only so many ways you can use 5 players on a court at a given time and try and, outscore your opponents over 48 minutes. These candidates are not dumb. If they think it's better to tweak what they historically do to fit the roster or the way the league is trending at a given time, they may do that. To me, what's more important, and it's why I don't want to make a hot board just yet in terms of exactly ranking the 5 or 6 top candidates, some of it's going to depend on exactly how they interview. And hopefully we get some leaks in terms of reports in the weeks ahead saying, what the Rockets think, their feedback after talking to these guys in depth. We heard from Rafael Stone at the press conference today talk about the importance of alignment, not just top to bottom, but bottom to top as well. They want the coach to ultimately sell them on the vision for what's right in terms of the system he's going to employ, why it fits for their players, and so on and so forth. I think more than anything, you want to get the intangibles right. And where the D'Antoni hire really succeeded, at the end of the day, he empowered his players. And in a version of the Rockets that had probably the most creative superstar of our time in James Harden, I think that empowerment, that's a word that so many of D'Antoni's players used, talking about the freedom that he gave them on and off the court. It unlocked the best version of James Harden, and in turn, that unlocked the best version of the Rockets. And I think that's something that you would have never really thought going into the coaching search in 2016, but that's the way it played out. And a lot of it was just sort of the intangible factor, how D'Antoni vibed with the front office, and more importantly, how he vibed with the players in the locker room, the connections that he built. I think he was also willing to acknowledge his own deficiencies in terms of not really having a ton of defensive background. So he went out and said, hey, Jeff Pasdelic is a guy who can implement what I want to do, and I can trust him to lead that side of the ball. And that was a part of building that great switch everything defense in 2018. I just think it's so important not to get bogged down in the specific X's and O's this early, and actually listen to these guys and try and figure out who is the best fit, not just in terms of the X's and O's, but in terms of how they click with the front office, how they click with the players, because ultimately it's those intangible factors that are so important to whether a coach can make everything click in a short time frame. With D'Antoni, we talk about why it worked out. With Silas, it's not so much that he didn't have those intangibles. It's more, I think, that the mix of a first-time head coach and a first-time GM got to be really awkward when you also had a super young roster and, basically no voice that had been there, done that in the NBA. So I think those intangibles went sideways for reasons that were largely out of Stephen's control. Nonetheless, I think there is a similar underlying dynamic to it in that the success of D'Antoni and the failure of Silas in relatively similar samples, D'Antoni 4 years, Silas 3 years, are based not just on tactical choices, but largely cultural decisions and moves they make, or at least moves that they're involved in, that go well and beyond what their previous track record is and the X's and O's. So to me, as I go into this process, I do have a baseline that I want candidates to clear in terms of, we talked about been there, done that. Most of the big names that are on the list to this point have plenty of head coaching experience, and typically they've either won NBA championships or gotten their team to the NBA finals. Once a guy has cleared that bar, because I do think that respect bar is important in terms of giving the organization more credibility entering free agency, I think so much of it just comes down to chemistry with the front office, ownership, his fellow coaches in terms of the staff that he or she puts together, obviously the players in the locker room. I guess my advice going into it is just keep an open mind when it comes to it not just being strictly X's and O's, here's who makes sense for the current roster, because that may change, but also who fits the best in terms of their personality, the overall package, the intangibles, with what's going to give the Rockets the best chance to catch lightning in a bottle the next few years.
Yeah, definitely. I think you just can't reiterate enough the situational part. And while you were speaking, I thought of two other cases. For example, Monty Williams early on with the Suns had no success, and then he adapted and eventually got success. He also got the help from CP3, and now you watch the Suns play, and X's and O's wise, and part of it is having a point guard that can execute those plays. But it's beautiful. I mean, they have a lot of offensive weapons with KD now, but they play beautiful basketball. And if you have looked at it 3 years ago, this is a coach that had them playing 20-win basketball, and now it's this good. The opposite, I mean, Nate McMillan with the Hawks came in as an interim, did really well for like half a season, and then the year afterwards they went to the Eastern Conference semifinals, and then the year after he was fired. Just so how quick things change. I also want to touch on the what you brought up about rookie GM, rookie head coach. There has been a lot of talk on Rockets Twitter about the report that came from Shams and Kelly Eco, and versus what other people had already been saying. We've heard all season about the GM's interference with the actual on-court product. Generally, I am someone who believes that each side to do their job. I think Stone has done a very good job as far as the typical GM stuff goes, the trades and everything. I don't think Stephen Silas has done a great job in the X's and O stuff. So that kind of also justifies a little bit of why Raphael interfering, while not good, was kind of somehow
Should also note, by the way, that
understandable.
the
Yeah.
report said this was in the, I believe, first or early in the second season of the 3 that Stephen Silas spent in Houston. So
Yep.
if you read the article, it makes it clear that it's a situation that has largely been resolved, that it's not something that continued into this season. Just want to clarify that.
Yep, and it makes sense tying that into what you said. I mean, it's a new GM. I mean, God knows how involved Daryl Morey was. Like Raphael Stone was under Daryl Morey before
Right.
becoming a GM. Daryl Morey was very much someone who interfered with what goes on the basketball side. He was, really big on analytics, but they played a big role in how the Rockets played basketball. He was credited a lot with how James Harden changed this game as well. So just before Rafaelson got to be a GM, he saw that a lot. And then at the same, and Michael D'Antoni was a coach that kind of worked that took that feedback and adapted it on the court, and it helped maximize what the Rockets were. And it makes sense that once Rafael became a GM, especially a rookie GM, and then a rookie head coach comes in, and neither of those guys ever really been in this position before, that it's hard to set those boundaries and
Right.
and what is and usually with these reports it's also hard to define like what is Rafael Stone actually just giving advice or giving his own opinion or thinking, hey, how can I help, trying to be helpful, and what is, hey, you're forced to do this, which is what I don't think was really happening. But
especially when the roster is that young. That's what I want to underscore. It's really the perfect storm, and it's why some of the stuff was so difficult the last few years. It's one thing, and my guess is that this was the vision. Well, I know this was the vision when the Rockets hired Stephen Silas in October 2020. The roster was very veteran laden. You had 2 former MVPs and James Harden and Russell Westbrook. You had role players like PJ Tucker and Robert Covington. They could largely take care of themselves. They knew what it took to win at an NBA level, as opposed to when you pivot on the fly to a roster that's so insanely young, like the last couple of years. They don't know how to figure it out. And so you have at that point, there's inevitably going to be people in the organization, the GM, the head coach, they all want to fix it. And yet they don't quite know where the boundaries are. They're all feeling it out because they're in those chairs for the first time. And yeah, it's the perfect storm for someone to potentially, maybe he thinks he's making a suggestion and the coach takes it as a mandate and stuff gets misinterpreted. There's all sorts of possibilities, but just really it's the combination of first-time coach, first-time GM, and a roster that's got, like half its players not even old enough to drink in the United States. It's a perfect storm for a mix that just wasn't right.
Exactly. That you put it perfectly to what I wanted to say. And then now to tie that into the next step, the next head coach. I think regardless of what has happened in the past, what is important now is that if they do get an experienced head coach, that would be great because that head coach has that experience, knows what the
Yes,
boundaries are, will have his own
bingo.
autonomy. That's a big deal to me. And Rafael, giving off the signs that he wants to be more hands off when it comes to the day to day or the on court product also helps draw in better head coaches.
By
To
the
try
way,
and
one
yeah,
last point on the Silas era that I want to get out before we turn the page to what's next, even though we've already sort of turned it, prefacing this. There were a lot of people I saw when the news leaked literally as soon as you got the final buzzer in Washington. There was some talk of why now? If it was this inevitable that they didn't even want to talk after the season, that everything had been, I suppose, closed for weeks in terms of the Silas era, and that there was nothing he could really do to save his job, then why didn't you make the move earlier? And that's where we talk about, the difficulties of a young roster. In my opinion, that's the biggest reason. Changing on the fly to an interim staff would have been extraordinarily difficult on top of all the usual difficulties for these young prospects. Rookies like Jabari Smith Jr. and Tari Eason, who played very well to close out the year and definitely in Washington in the finale. Even your so-called veterans, look, Jalen Green and Alfred Şengün are in year 2, Kevin Porter Jr. in year 4. That's really like a year 3 because he basically lost his second year in the NBA with the trade, COVID, everything else going on surrounding him off the court. It would have been very difficult for that group to deal with adapting to an interim, especially an interim who was unlikely, be it John Lucas or Lionel Hollins, that probably wasn't going to be your guy for the next year. So it'd be an interim for just a few months, and then you go through a new coach all over again. They didn't want to do that. So that's why this drug out. I've seen some suggesting that, well, they should have just ripped the Band-Aid off earlier. Maybe part of it is, you want to give Stephen Silas a fair shake for his next organization. You don't want to look like you're scapegoating him. You don't want him to air dirty laundry. But the bigger deal, I just don't think they wanted to put the players through that. They were very aware of just how hard it is when the team is this young and you're doing everything else. And I just don't think they wanted to put the team through a coaching change on the fly when they could just have a much more peaceful transition in the offseason. So that's why the timing was what it was. And then the other point, I've seen some go back even further and say, well, since I believe Brian T. Smith of the Chronicle has pointed out that the Rockets are having some of these conversations as far back as last offseason. Why didn't you do it then? First off, that would have been after 2 years. That would have been really quick, even by NBA standards. And beyond the financial angles, look at the Texans. The Texans were in a similar place in their rebuild to the Rockets, and they went through a coaching change in 2022, and the best they could do was Lovie Smith. And he obviously did not work out, and they had to do this all over again a year later. This year, they had a successful coaching search and got arguably the best candidate on the market in D'Amico Ryans because they were much better positioned in a franchise. As a franchise, they had immediate cap room, just like the Rockets do, so the coach can reshape the roster to his liking. They had all their draft picks. The young prospects were a year more advanced in development. It was just a way better time for the Rockets, or for the Texans, excuse me, to be desirable on the market in 2023. In my opinion, that's also part of the calculus for the Rockets. If they go through this process a year ago, they are not anywhere near as desirable because, of course, the prospects are way younger. They're nowhere near cap room, and there's all this upheaval. By keeping Silas as long as they did, they basically had Stephen sort of navigate them through all the turbulence. And that's why I think Rafael was being genuine when he thanks Stephen for everything that he did and believes he, on a lot of levels, did a great job. It would not have been as advantageous to the Rockets to enter the market a year ago or even a few months ago. Now is really the right time to strike while the iron is hot. So I apologize for interjecting. Just wanted to close the loop on the Silas era as far as the timing and why it played out when it did.
Yeah, for sure. And so I'll tie it into a little bit of the Stone press conference from today because I think there was a lot to talk about. But before we move on, there's many topics to talk about. But I'll tie into the coaching part. I think if there was one theme that when Rafael Stone talked about the coaching during the press conference was confidence. He said, you know, for someone who's usually really calculated and doesn't say a lot and doesn't put a lot of pressure on himself and doesn't, usually you're surprised when they make a move, and so they usually try to set it up so people don't expect anything soon. Rafael Stone said that he'll start the process looking for a new head coach quickly, and that there's no value in waiting, and that they'll be quick once they identify the guy that they like, that they'll go after him and they'll sign him. Afterwards, he said, when asked about whether the Rockets are an attractive situation, he said, "I think this is a very attractive situation. Based on my phone ringing today, other people seem
Yep.
to think so too." And so these are two to me, very strong statements of I'm confident that I'll be getting, one of the top candidates, and that there's a lot of interest. And then, cooler minds prevailed, and then he was asked again about something about head coaches with experience versus head coaches with not so much experience. And then he went on the classic GM talk of we'll have a search and we'll try to interview as many people as we can. And I wanted to touch on that because I think that's really important. Even if you already have, but let's imagine a scenario where they've already picked a head coach right now, and then they're just waiting for something to happen. Even in that scenario, while you don't want to give off that vibe because you don't want other coaches to just reject, say that they don't want to interview with you. I think that's one of the things that was reported that happened with Evan Mobley, that his agent thought that they were already going with Jalen Green and they were just interviewing him to gather more info, so he didn't come to the interview. I think it's important to kind of listen to as many head coaches as possible, even if
Sure.
you're not going to hire them, because usually or at least from what I remember, in a head coaching interview, guys sell you on their vision for the team, and so there's a lot of data points and a lot of different approaches that you get from different basketball minds
Yep.
on how you can maximize this team. And no matter if you're hiring these guys or not, that's always a good thing. There might be some idea somewhere that if you didn't give someone an interview, you wouldn't have gotten, even if you don't hire that person.
And that's another thing from the last two Rockets coaching searches, by the way. In 2016, Stephen Silas was a finalist to Mike D'Antoni. Guess what? Silas ends up getting the job in the next search 4 years later. In that 2020 search that Silas got, one of the other finalists was John Lucas. And it turns out that John Lucas ends up accepting the role as lead assistant. So even if you don't hire a guy in this interview process for ultimately the lead gig, there's value in simply making that contact, gathering information, and keeping them in mind for other possibilities down the road. Or in the case of Lucas, another possibility in a couple of weeks.
Yep, exactly. One other takeaway that I took from the whole head coaching questions that Rafael Stone asked, and I think is really important, especially considering that context that we gave before, as far as him being too hands-on or whatever. He mentioned that while he'd hope that whatever head coach end up bringing in would find some of the current coaching staff useful that they'd want to keep around. Ultimately, they'll have the coaches will have whatever coach they bring in will have the final say on who the assistants are, and they'll get to pick whatever the coaching staff is. I think that's progress. Stephen Silas, when he came in, I don't think got the chance to actually pick his entire coaching staff until this year. So I think that's a step in the right direction. I think that's one of the things that you have to do if you want to get a top tier head coach. That
And
being
that was
said,
actually a big change from the Daryl Morey era. This came up in 2019 when they were trying to negotiate an extension with Mike D'Antoni, excuse me, and they ultimately couldn't get it done. One of the things that I suppose annoyed Mike was the idea that his entire coaching staff was being changed beneath him without his consent. And of course, we know the last year of D'Antoni in Houston, who was it? I'm blanking on the guy who was his top assistant that they brought in from the Kings. Oh yeah, Elston Turner. I'm not trying to throw Turner under the bus, but it was handpicked by Gerald Morey and the basketball operations team, and that's the way it had run. And so it was a bit of a transition because, of course, when they went from Morey to Stone in 2020, it was honestly midway through a coaching search. So it took a couple of years for things to truly transition to, I suppose, a structure that's more conventional, like most other teams where the head coach has full autonomy. But yeah, you're right. That gives you the most options when it comes to hiring the right coach, because that coach wants the ability to hire as he sees fit for the positions underneath him.
yeah, and so knowing that, I want to touch a little bit on what my current, tier list looks like as far as head coaches go. I think just like last episode, Nick Nurse is still my number one. And I've since dug into it a little bit deeper, and it's just I think it just makes sense from an accountability standpoint. I think it makes sense from one of the things I value the most on head coach is their ability to adapt on the fly during playoff series, and I think Nick Nurse is a really good coach there. I think he's more of a defensive minded coach, and one of my personal favorite assistants on the Rockets right now, Mahmoud Abdel Fattah, is more of an offensive minded head coach, I think. And so if they are, and I would love for him to stay, and so if they are considering letting him stay, which I hope they do, I think it could be a cool dynamic between him, between Nick and Mahmoud. Um, as far as that dynamic goes, I have him and Kenny Atkinson in tier one. I wasn't a big fan of Kenny Atkinson, but since then, I've been talking to a bunch of people about what he did in Brooklyn, and I think he, took a very bad Nets team. They eventually got to the playoffs, no matter how weak the Eastern Conference was. His roster was also weak, so in comparison, it's still encouraging. He since then has spent, I think, 2 or 3 years with the Warriors. Hopefully he has learned a little bit of the offensive philosophy, and I really like, if he has learned some of those principles, how that can translate into Jalen Green's game and a passing big like Sengun, compared to someone like Draymond, at least on offense. Since I really want Jalen Green to transition into a more off-ball approach on offense. Then I've got, actually, surprisingly enough, I have tier two with Ime Udoka, depending on, of course, the circumstances that end up arising, coming from the fact that he, was basically fired or suspended with the Celtics, and then the Brooklyn Nets were about to hire him. It was surefire thing, and then last second they dropped out. So I'm not quite sure how that dynamic is, but as far as his job as a head coach, I think he did an incredible job. He took the Celtics to the finals. I have Abdel Fattah tier two as well, and then tier three I have Frank Vogel, and then I have a lot of, you know, kind of the names that have been thrown around in the report so far. I don't have a couple of them because I'm not a big fan of Scott Brooks or James Borrego, but I have Becky Hammond, who has an incredible job in the WNBA. I have Kelvin Sampson, who, I mean, if he wants to coach NBA again, I think the Rockets would be the perfect situation, and I think his mentality with our young guys, if he can bring some of that culture with him, that'd be a great option as well. Sam Cassell's been, you know, at the gates to get a head coaching job for a while. He's still an assistant. He's worked with James Harden. If James Harden's coming in, that makes sense as well. And an underrated name that I don't see a lot of people bring up is actually Brett Brown, who got tasked with the process Sixers and got a lot of those players to develop, and he is known to be good with development around the league. And I mean,
And he's worked with Popovich the last couple of years.
yep, and he was kind of made a joke out of because he was fired from that Sixers team. But then, I mean, look at what's happened to, for example, Ben Simmons since Brett Brown left. It's not exactly been a lot better than what it was with him, and a lot of people questioned the fit between Embiid and Simmons with Brett Brown. Well, it didn't get better as time went on, so I think he'll eventually deserve a shout. I hope the Rockets get an interview with him. I think he'd be a good shout. Yeah, that's basically where I sit as far as this head coaching race goes. Part of me wants it to be quick. Part of me wants, the adrenaline rush of finding out who the next head coach is going to be. But they're reasonable, and the reason in me wants this to maybe be drawn out a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, a month, whatever it needs to be, so they get a lot of interviews in.
Yeah. One thing I'll say with regards to the timing, I really don't think this is a situation where the Rockets are going to try and draw this out beyond the draft lottery. Now, it's possible that maybe if they want to do a thorough search and they have lots of good candidates and they want to bring them in for multiple rounds of interviews, that's just how it happens. But from everything that I know from doing my own digging, I really think that only Wemby and that's a 14% shot at getting Victor Wembanyama with the number 1 overall pick, would be like a transformational thing as far as potentially making them even more desirable or changing perhaps exactly who they might go after in free agency or the years of their contract terms and so on and so forth. Even guys in the 2 through 4 range, I don't think they view, say, the difference between getting 2 through 4 and 5 through 7, while still significant, don't get me wrong, I don't think they view it as all that different in terms of, well, if we get even Scoot Henderson or Brandon Miller, that's going to make us way more desirable than if we end up with, you know, one of the Thompson twins or Jarris Walker. In terms of what it means for free agency and their long-term positioning, while they would certainly prefer to get in that Scoot Henderson / Brandon Miller tier, I don't think it's really transformational. Like, well, we might wait on the coaching search to see if we get a little bit of a stimulus from that. No, I think the only real stimulus that would materially change how they're looking at, I guess, the overall rebuild and the timeline is Wemby, and that's 14%. I don't think you wait around on basically a 14% shot saying, well, maybe we get this, because the 86% shot is that you're not going to get this. And maybe you just end up stalling for no reason and losing some of your candidates. I liked your list. I agree that really I have Nurse at the front of my list. I do like his background. And as far as some of the reports of friction this year with the Raptors, should mention that in terms of the synergies that I talked about earlier, the chemistry with the front office, the alignment, the fact that he has a track record with the Rockets and many members of the current front office, including Rafael Stone, Eli Whitus, I think that's important. I also think that with regards to everything that's reportedly gone on in Toronto, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. Even good coaches typically have a short lifespan in a given job. What you're looking for is to catch lightning in a bottle in a limited sample. And beyond that, anything is a bonus, because so much of what happens in terms of coaches around the league is situational. And I think, we talked about this last week, but Toronto, once they lost Kawhi Leonard, they were in that good but not great tier. They didn't really have a clear path to get back to that next level. A lot of veterans. It's easy to tune out on the coach, because also the players know that's the easiest position to potentially change. There's just so many factors, and that's why all over the league, not just in Houston, you see coaches having very short lifespans in a given spot. It's just so easy to change. And so I don't really hold that against him. And I see the most upside for synergies with the Rockets front office, the chemistry, the fit being right based on his history. So that's why, assuming he becomes available from the Raptors, hopefully they lose this week in the play-in tournament. That's why I am very curious about him as well. Although, again, you do want to go through the interview process with an open mind. The other thing that I think is noteworthy on the coaching process as we get started, I know you took some heat on Twitter yesterday for your tweet about the Rockets having a better initial list than the Pistons, for example. That the Rockets are being linked to guys like Nurse and Vogel and Scott Brooks and Ime Udoka and Kenny Atkinson, guys that have been there, done that. And the Pistons, it looked like were a bit more analogous to the Rockets when they were looking into guys like Stephen Silas and John Lucas that weren't A-listers. We know the Rockets briefly flirted with Doc Rivers, but Philadelphia was a better situation for him, and perhaps they offered more money as well. That's the angle that I think is noteworthy in 2023. Beyond just the fact the Rockets have a promising young core in place, all this cap room to remake the roster as the coach may see fit. I'm sure they'll have some input on personnel, or at least dialogue with the front office. If it's a coach with credibility, Houston is the 4th largest city in the U.S. It should be an attractive destination for free agents. We heard Rafael Stone allude to that today, and so on and so forth. Some of it also comes down to salary. Why did Kenny Atkinson not take the job with Charlotte after he initially, according to reports, was ready to take it? It's been reported that it came down to how much or how little, in that case, the Hornets front office was willing to invest in the assistant coaches. Or I suppose it's not the front office, it's really ownership that sets the budgets. And so I think for the Rockets to be linked to the quality of names that have come out thus far, it shows a willingness by Tillman Fertitta to invest. And that's something that I think, we've talked about in the past. I think they had to learn the hard way. The criticisms in terms of not paying a luxury tax in 2019 in particular are real. But I also think a lot of success early on in the Fertitta era of Rockets ownership, which began in 2017, it came too easy. I think they had to learn some hard lessons about corners that you can cut in other businesses that you can't in the NBA. People will notice. They do take a toll on your reputation and your prestige around the league as well in terms of luring the right coaches, free agents, whatever it may be. And so I think we've consistently seen the last few years a willingness by ownership to step up and do the little things like paying for second round picks in the case of KJ Martin, or taking on salary to get future second round picks. Nothing sexy, just doing the little things to go the extra mile. And I know some, they'll acknowledge the praise and say, we're not going to fully buy in until we get back to the contending level again and see if the Fertitta era Rockets actually pay the luxury tax and how willing they are, how many times to do that. That's completely fair. But what I do think is that we've seen a trend that they at least realize that ownership spending can be a key variable. And this is a spot where I've said it so many times, there's no salary cap on coaching hires. And just as with any corporate job, there's a question asked early on in the process by agents that gets to the heart of just how willing ownership is to invest. Just as with any big business job, you don't see these companies wasting time with these interviews and weeks and weeks of conversations only to get to the end of the process and learn that, oh, this candidate wants way more money than we're willing to spend. No, big businesses have cutoffs early in the process where whoever the representation is of that person, in this case, it's their agent, they'll state their salary expectations, and the Rockets know going in and will proceed accordingly based on whether there's potentially a deal to be had once you hypothetically decide on them as the guy. And you have to decide, am I willing to actually finalize a deal? Am I able to do that? In this case, the fact that the Rockets are linked to bigger names than they were in 2020, it tells me that beyond the fact that the organization is looked at fairly positively in terms of the young talent, a lot of cap space, Houston's a good market, all the things we've laid out, sort of similar to the landscape that led the Texans to D'Amico Ryans a few months ago. I also think that behind the scenes, there's clearly been a willingness to spend that's been expressed to the agents of these big time coaches, because they would not go down this road with the Rockets if they knew that they just weren't going to ultimately be a fit based on finances. It's, again, there's some people I understand based on the past, they're not going to give Tillman Fertitta the benefit of the doubt on anything until they see it. But from where I'm sitting, there has to be at least some positives you can take from a list that's this strong with top tier candidates. Because again, I don't think the Rockets want to set the bar that high in terms of the expectations if ultimately it's going to come out later that, oh, well, we couldn't get them because they wanted too much money. No, they know how that's going to come out to the fan base. To me, they're leaking these names because they truly believe, as you were saying, that they can get them. That's the only reason why it makes sense to be that confident. You have a good idea that some of these guys will say yes. And in addition to speaking well of the basketball side of the organization, I think it speaks well to ownership in addition to that. And so I think, again, not trying to sort of wash away the past. I get that some will be hesitant to fully buy in, but I do think it's fair to say that on some level, this is a positive for Tillman Fertitta as well, right?
So I think the biggest testament to Tillman potentially changing, to me, there's two of them. To me, it's the fact that we don't consistently see him on TV talking about the Rockets anymore. We don't. It just feels like he's way more hands off than he was before, and he seems to have slid, his son Patrick in there to, kind of play his role of the ownership being represented in the room when the big decisions are made. I think that's a big deal. The other big deal is the willingness to go into the rebuild will cost you way more money than most of us could ever imagine just on sales, and just not being a relevant team for a while will cost a franchise a lot, which is why teams like the Wizards, for example, will never go through a full rebuild, because it is a sacrifice for ownership to go through all of that, and they only go through that when the ultimate goal is to actually win a championship. It isn't just to be a profitable franchise. It's also to be successful from a sporting perspective. And so to me
And that can
that's
help
the
you
biggest
business
deal.
wise as well. That's the part of the equation that I think early on people don't get.
Yeah, for sure. And so I do think it's an interesting perspective what you said about the fact that we're linked to these coaches means that we're willing to spend, because otherwise, why would considering the position the Rockets are in right now, what benefit is there really to getting expectations really high up only to disappoint if you know you're going to disappoint from the get-go?
Right.
The other thing I want to touch on, and when I tweeted this wasn't a shot at the Pistons. It was very much hey, everybody paints us as this, evil franchise of Satan that,
Right.
everything's going wrong. Well, at the same time, we're being tied to some pretty big names. And, I haven't been a fan for that long, but I've been looking at the history of Rockets coaches, and obviously I don't have insight into what the coaching scene looked like back then. But if the Rockets get Nick Nurse, which is, I think, very clearly a top two candidate of the coaches available around the league, to one of the most desired names, or Ime Udoka, or Kenny Atkinson, and I'll stop at those three. Have the Rockets ever gotten a head coach, or not ever, but since they won a championship, ever gotten a head coach with such a big profile, like just a high profile name as one of those three guys would be? And I think the answer is probably no. And now to consider that's the case, while they came off of three 20 or 21 and under win seasons, I think that's pretty telling of what we have in house and how exciting and how appealing that can be. So that was more of my angle coming into it. It wasn't to say, oh, the Pistons are worse than the Rockets because they can't get these names. No, because you could target, small names on purpose. They just had Dwayne Casey, who is, before when during his time in Toronto was a very good head coach, had really good records across those seasons. Maybe that's not what they're after, but you can't seriously tell me that if they had the chance that they just wouldn't, interview or be linked to candidates like
Right.
what the Rockets are doing. That being said, I don't know if you want to touch on anything about the coaching. I actually wanted to talk about kind of Rafael Stone's entire, I guess, posture and the way he addressed the media this press conference versus what he usually does in these press conferences. Usually, people, when they talk about Rafael Stone, and even yesterday, even earlier today, when the press conference was announced, people were like, "Oh, he's not going to say anything. It's just he's going to talk about Silas, talk positive about Silas, not really say anything, or try to be as lawyerish as he can, not give away too much." And I'd actually say it was the complete opposite. He looked a lot more open. He was a lot more enthusiastic. He, was actually giving off information that we didn't have before about a lot of topics. And to me, that's a stark change from what he was before. And we've talked about this earlier on the pod. And I think Rafael's kind of learning a little bit of that, and kind of tying it together to what Maury did, which is if you don't come out from time to time and set the narrative yourself, and hold and own the questions that are thrown at you and answer,
Yes.
people are going to write the narrative for you.
Yep.
And that's what's happened this
won't wait
year.
around.
Exactly. And that's why a lot of people are lower on Rafael Stone than they were before. Because if you don't say anything, what stands is what the Bill Simmons of the world are going to say, what the Chris Mannixes of the world are going to say. All of these, outside sources that a lot of them don't have the Rockets' best interests in mind, and some of them actually have agendas against the Rockets. So I like that we saw a more Maury-like Rafael Stone this press conference, and I think it will bode well just for him as far as job security goes, or at least public perception of him goes. And I mean, just as a fan, that's what you want to see. I want to be excited. I want my GM to come out and talk and get me excited for what's about to happen, even if it ends up disappointing, because at least you won't get the narrative turned against you, and you won't be told that, oh, Rafael Stone's front office is kind of apathetic and just tries to kind of not do as little as they can and kind of delay decisions. And I think
This is proactive.
This is proactive. That's not the repetition that you wanted to have. And so I actually really appreciated the change in tone from Rafael in this press conference.
Yeah, and to I guess, put a bow on all of this as we wind down the podcast. I thought his strongest answer was actually when he pushed back on the culture criticism from players and especially media members who he talked about. Many of them have not actually been on the ground in Houston, so they don't have firsthand knowledge. That's something that I've noticed as well with some of the loudest critics. They haven't actually been here, so they don't truly know what's going on behind the scenes. It's like a game of telephone, and they're just making various assumptions. I thought that hits in with the exact same theme as what we were talking about a few minutes ago with Tillman and this overall confidence vibe. You don't say that if you're not going to be able to soon back it up. And the easiest way to back it up is you have an impact offseason. You go out and you make the right coaching hire, you get the right veterans, be it James Harden or others, that bring in the type of instant respect and credibility that even your loudest critics will have to acknowledge and say, you know what? They've got something there. They know what they're doing. Even if this was a weakness, they're addressing it. That to me, for him to go as strongly as he did in some of his remarks, and a couple of them, I literally almost laughed when I was sitting there at Toyota Center during the press conference when a couple of these people lost their mind. He was so blunt and so direct. You don't say that if you're going to go out and hire a coach who's off the radar and a couple of mid-tier veterans who don't really move the needle, just analogous to what you had in Eric Gordon the last couple of years. Because then you make yourself the butt of the joke. It looks like there's no teeth when you say those things. To be that willing to control the narrative, number one, I think it's useful in general, but it's only useful if you intend to actually follow through on it with action, particularly at a point like this offseason where you can't defer any longer. You can't say, well, maybe in a year or two. No, the head coach position is vacant right now. You're going to have $60 million in cap space this offseason. It's right there. So you can't sort of walk your way away from this. You're going to have to take action in the very near term. And I think that Rafael speaking with so much confidence and the organization putting that out there, it just doesn't make sense to do that if you're not ready to follow through on that in the coming weeks. So to sort of tie it all together, I think that's why you should be very optimistic about what this offseason has in store. And I think it's going to be very fun to watch in the weeks and months ahead. Paolo, that's all I've got for today. Is there anything else you wanted to throw in before we close out?
Yeah, to that quote, to this last quote, I think there was something that he said that a lot of people aren't picking up on, which is, well, first of all, before he started that answer, he said, he stopped for a second, he laughed to himself, and he said, okay, how am I going to say this from a PR standpoint? I don't know if y'all remember that. I don't know if the people listening to the clip remember that.
Yeah,
and then,
I knew as soon as he said that it was going to be good.
Yeah, and then and it's a good thing that he went through the thought process. He was like, I'm not going to do too much, but I'm going to stand my ground here and finally say or tell my side of the story. I thought that was a common theme across the whole press conference. But he also said that he feels that sometimes people carry over narratives from before his tenure into his tenure where nobody basically in the entire Rockets structure is the same. Not the same front office, not the same team, not the same coaching staff, not the same anything. The only thing that's common is it's still the Houston Rockets, but they still sometimes carry some of the reputation from the Daryl Morey era. And a lot of people said, or kind of took from that oh, was there locker room problems during the Morey era? I mean, they were pretty successful. This guy has had 320-win seasons. Why is he talking about Morey? What I actually think he meant was, during the Morey era, the Rockets were known as not being that player friendly, unless you were a star, and we've seen this before when Morey left, treating players as assets, and the fact that free agents really didn't want to, or mid-tier free agents didn't want to come to Houston because they felt like they were just an asset and that they could get traded at any time. And so why would I sign here if I'm not really signing here and I'll be in 6 months, if anything, I could be traded. And without much regard to, who I am as a person or who I am as a player. I think that was more of the angle.
I personally thought that it was a bit of a veiled reference to the James Harden rules. And I thought it was encouraging from the standpoint that if James comes back, it won't be like he has complete control of the franchise like he did 4 or 5 years ago. I think that's sort of dovetails with the point that you were making. But I think that's what he was getting at, is that people view, because when James was here, there was so much extracurricular that was allowed to go on. They just assume that there's no control and that basically these guys can do whatever they want. And so when they see anything that's out of the ordinary at all, like the Kevin Porter Jr. and Christian Wood incidents on New Year's Day, literally like a year and a half ago, they just assume that it's same old, same old. This is the Rockets. There's no adult in the room. They just let these guys do whatever they want. And so I took it to mean this is not the James Harden years of, I guess that's, your point is valid as well, that there's a separate set of rules for everybody else. I just think that was the point he was making. It wasn't so much anti-Daryl. Honestly, it's the entire organization. He was a part of it as well. That's not the culture they have now. And I think that's what he was trying to get at. And honestly, I think it's pretty encouraging in a summer in which, they may be bringing James back. And some people are wondering, well, are they going to do that again? No, to me, it was an indication that clearly they're going to do it differently if they do.
Yeah, and two other things that I want to bring up really quick, just so we don't miss on them, because I've got to bring them up now. I don't think we'll ever talk about this again. First of all, one of the little tidbits that came with the Silas firing was that Jalen Green's, I'll call it entourage, even though that's not really the name, but his coaches, and his camp, were pushing for more set plays and for Silas to run more plays rather than the more freestyle type of pickup type game that they were playing. I thought that was really revealing, and a lot of people say that, including some Rockets fans, that this is how Jalen Green wants to play basketball. That he is a ball hog. That he wants the ball to himself. He wants to go to work. He it's my time to cook, whatever. This shows the exact opposite. That what they think is best for his development, as far as the Jalen Green side is, hey, I'm more of this type of true shooting guard. I can create for myself some, but I also a big part of my game is moving off ball, is having plays ran for me, and me just using my athleticism to execute them. And that was something that I think bodes really well for the future, especially since you're bringing in a lot more talent. You're not going to have as many reps to just throw around, and you're going to try to play winning basketball. It's good that it's not a problem for Jalen to perhaps have less on-ball reps with more playmakers coming into the season. And the last little bit that I wanted to talk about is Profil's definition of culture seems to be a little different from what a lot of people say. He talked about how the players on the team kind of like each other and they're with each other, outside of practices, and then they go out together and everything like that. Usually when people talk about culture, they talk about the effort on the court and everything like that. And I think the effort on the court was lackluster for huge stretches of the season, but I think a lot of that also just comes with the territory of being a terrible team and not playing for anything. And the head coach is not holding people accountable. It's harder to take it out of yourself to have that fire to still play hard 100% of the time where it's fruitless. With that being said, I think it's a big deal. It's a really big deal that guys get along and outside of the court are actually friends, because I think that will be a real tool when the time comes to play winning basketball and them sticking together, rather than hopefully those ties grow stronger when we actually play winning basketball and we don't get situations like Harden and CP3, for example, who respected each other and seemed like they got along, but there wasn't that inherent friendship behind it to when the times got tough. Things went south.
Yep. I also think that resonates with other NBA players, and it may make you more desirable as a destination. To close this out, we've been talking about the importance of the coaching hire to obviously make them more attractive with regards to the upcoming free agency, all the salary cap room they have. We know the leverage trades that are always possible, and so on and so forth. Having chemistry within your locker room and a culture that guys around the league see, I think he's confident, and hopefully he's right, that a lot of these hot take shows, like what you hear from Kendrick Perkins or JJ Redick, not that JJ Redick is a hot take guy, but that's I think one of the harsh things that's been said in recent months. Jonathan Givony, we know what he threw out there a few weeks ago. I think part of Stone's confidence is this idea that at some point the facts actually matter, and people around the league that are close enough to be behind the scenes and are actually in Houston and see how these guys interact, perhaps that perception wins out at the end of the day. And, as players see that, they realize what the culture is actually like in Houston. And who knows, maybe that's why it was tougher, especially in 2019 when they had so much confidence thinking they can get Jimmy Butler. Ultimately, they didn't. Maybe in part, the players around the league were skeptical about the culture at that time. And, we know Trevor Ariza, some of the harsh things he has said since. Perhaps that's a factor as well. And that could go into the confidence, the fact that it's not just about the perception. You also can control that with your own actions. And perhaps some of this off-court stuff, again, not going to take a victory lap on it because these guys are all so young in their development. There's plenty of time for it to go the other direction. But yeah, that's why I do think that it matters. And especially the longer it goes, the next few years, as these guys continue to develop and the Rockets draw more attention around the league, I think it's the kind of thing that ultimately that's going to outweigh anything that gets said on First Take or even the more serious podcasts. At some point, the facts actually do matter, what's going on the ground. And so hopefully the Rockets can change their perception in that way as well. And I think Rafael believes that this past year was the start of that. And let's give Stephen some credit as well. That's what Rafael did at the end of his answer. Stephen was important in, I think some of the players even referred to him as a father-like figure. He developed a close emotional rapport. I do think that's an underrated component to the change. Some of the players I've heard took this rather hard, and that's another reason why, again, you don't do it during the regular season. You give them the off season to decompress, to meet the new coach, to get ready for this next phase. And yeah, if in fact the culture is as positive as Steven seems to believe, and from everything that I've seen it is, there were times a year ago that you could see some questionable things. This year I didn't see it. On the ground, they looked like a very together group. They weren't good, but they're young. That comes to the territory. I do think they liked one another. And at the end of the day, if they can build on that, it's very important. And ultimately, the facts are going to matter, even if people just aren't paying enough attention to the Rockets right now because they're so bad to notice. At some point, they will. And so hopefully the next coach can build on that, but give Stephen some flowers as well. It started with Stephen Silas, and that's something that even if we disagree with him tactically, even if we think the mix wasn't right, he did succeed on at least bonding with those players and getting them to buy into the team construct. I think that's important. So if nothing else, we can hat tip to Stephen Silas for that. Anyway, with that, we'll put a bow on this extended episode of The Logger Line. For Paolo Alves, I'm Ben Dubose. As I mentioned leading off the show, you can follow him on Twitter at Paolo Alves NBA, me at Ben Dubose. Also, this show, The Logger Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Karbach Brewing. Follow us on Twitter at The Logger Line. That's where you can find our link tree, and that has all the links to not only our individual podcast distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you want to listen to this podcast. You can certainly find the link there, but also our friends and partners, sponsors, Karbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, Rockets Wire of USA Today Sports Media Group. You can access their content there as well, simply by going to our link tree. It has everything you need to get better connected with this show, The Logger Line. With those plugs complete, we will finally adjourn. For Paolo Alves, I'm Ben Dubose. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode. It's going to be a busy off season. We've got plenty of guests lined up, so all I can tell you, stay tuned. We will be back in the very near future with more as we break down the 2023 off season for your Houston Rockets.
There's nothing more satisfying than finding the perfect green paint for your living room. Except maybe popping open that can of Valspar Ultra and rolling that first smooth stroke on the wall. And there's nothing more satisfying than admiring your freshly painted wall.
Ooh.
Except maybe peeling off the painter's tape to see those crisp edges. But the most satisfying part of all? Valspar Ultra's price tag, starting at $29.98 a gallon. Affordable, durable, available at Lowe's. Price varies by Sheen.